Hey guys, this is PODFIC, and today we're going to be reading Bedrotten by Alexa Effect. The summary is, he glanced back towards Bruce, who now had an arm wrapped around the woman's waist. When Bruce leaned in to kiss her cheek, the sudden burst of nausea surprised Jason. Now, it wasn't unusual for him to be revolted by his father's antics. It was, however, unusual for Jason to have an actual physical reaction. He swallowed heavily, wincing when it did nothing to relieve the steadily rising queasiness. A glance toward his empty glass didn't solve the mystery either. He'd had remarkably little to drink that night, especially if you took into consideration that Jason was here against his will. A nicotine flash then? Also no. He'd barely smoked half a cigarette. His speculation about the cause of his uneasiness did nothing to relieve it. Jason swallowed again, trying to fight back the discomfort. It was to no avail. Before he could steal the attention away from his father by doing something equally stupid, like throwing up the middle of the bathroom, Jason fled. Or, alternatively, Jason gets poisoned during a gala and is bedridden. He isn't left alone for a second of it. Alright, without further ado, let's hop right in. Come on! Jason looked over his shoulder and raised an eyebrow at Tim, who was gesturing for Jason to follow him inside. Before he could ask, the door had already swung shut. Jason put his cigarette out, then he was running inside, following his younger brother to where their father was standing, already looking as drunk as could be. Ah, so that was why. Bruce hugged Tim when he saw him, stumbling just enough that he had to catch himself on his brother's frame, but not enough to fall over or to seriously incapacitate Tim. Jason was used to it by now. They all were. Everywhere they went, Bruce had to make a scene. Something to keep up the public image. Something to excite the headlines tomorrow. To be fair, he did excel at it. Looking at his father now, Jason never would have guessed that this man was the notorious Batman. In fact, if someone would have told Jason as much, he probably would have laughed in their face. If they continued to insist on it, then he probably would have hit them. Bruce handed his drink off to him, and Jason didn't have it in his heart to be mad when the liquor spilled on his sleeve. They made eye contact, and, just for a second, Bruce sobered up and gave him a reassuring smile. Then he code-switched again and winked playfully. He shouted the name of some young woman. She looked around, at first annoyed at the impolite disturbance of the party. Then her expression became one of absolute delight when she saw it was the Bruce Wayne approaching, even if it wasn't in a straight line. Before his father could embarrass himself any further, Jason downed the glass in his hand, gagging at the sickly sweet taste. Beside him, Tim laughed again, and Jason rolled his eyes. He wasn't sure whether it was directed at Bruce or at himself. He probably didn't want to know. He glanced back towards Bruce, who now had an arm wrapped around the woman's waist. When Bruce leaned in to kiss her cheek, the sudden burst of nausea surprised Jason. Now, it wasn't unusual for him to be revolted by his father's antics. It was, however, unusual for Jason to have an actual physical reaction. He swallowed heavily, wincing when it did nothing to relieve the steady rising queasiness. A glance toward his empty glass didn't solve the mystery either. He'd only had 2 glasses of champagne, plus whatever liquor Bruce had been drinking, which couldn't have been that high of a percentage either, considering that fruity taste. All in all, he'd had remarkably little to drink that night, especially if you took into consideration that Jason was here against his will. A nicotine flash then? Also no, he'd barely smoked half a cigarette. His speculation about the cause of his uneasiness did nothing to relieve it. Already an unnatural heat was building in his body, starting in his chest and working its way into his limbs. He was sure that he looked pale enough to rival a corpse. Either that, or he was more flushed than Damien when someone peeked at his sketchbook. He wasn't sure which he preferred. Jason swallowed again, trying to fight back the discomfort. It was to no avail. Before he could steal the attention away from his father by doing something equally stupid, like throwing up in the middle of a ballroom, Jason fled. He set his empty glass on the nearest table. The small action took more effort than it should have, keeping his pace at a calculated speed. Not too slow or fast, and most importantly, not too suspicious. He beelined for the nearest exit. When he was safely out of sight, he pressed a hand against the wall to steady himself. Nausea, vertigo, too warm. He took a step forward, then another. Inch by inch, Jason managed his way towards the restroom. Thank God it was empty. His hand shook as he opened a stall door, shivering, cold, too hot skin. That was his last thought before Jason dropped to his knees and emptied what little he had in his stomach. He continued gagging long after he'd finished, grimacing when the nausea didn't let up. Okay, Not the typical had too much to drink or smoke sickness. If it were, he'd be feeling better now. Unsteady hands made undoing the top few buttons of his dress shirt difficult. It seemed like an eternity before he could finally pull the fabric away from his neck and replace it with 2 fingers. Heightened pulse, profuse sweating, feverish. "Are you okay?" Jason jumped at the voice, frantically looking up to see Dick standing over him. How long had he been standing there? How had he managed to sneak up on Jason? He supposed he could add delirium to his ever-growing list of symptoms. "I don't know, Jason stuttered through his words, swallowing back the panic that threatened him. What the hell was wrong with him? He looked back at Dick with wide eyes. All he could do was repeat, "I don't know." Dick knelt down in front of him, a too quick motion that set Jason's vision swimming. He squeezed his eyes shut. It did nothing to combat the feeling of the world spinning around him. He didn't open them when Dick released his fingers against Jason's pulse point with his own. He didn't blink when Dick swore and moved his hand from Jason's neck to his forehead. He just relished the cool hand against the fire that burned within him. "Jason!" He opened them again, and immediately flinched back at the hand snapping just an inch in front of his nose. Too close to focus on, or maybe that was just the headache? Either way, Dick's hand had left his forehead, and Jason couldn't remember when. "Are you with me?" his brother asked, and Jason narrowed his eyes, trying to make out the expression on Dick's face. His vision clouded again, and he gave up. "Think so," he answered. He sounded far away, as though someone had dunked his head below water. "What's wrong with him?" Jason glared at the new voice, peering over Dick's shoulder to catch a glimpse of the blurry blonde figure. It was more by matter of exclusion than sight that he recognized Steph. How long had she been standing there? How had Jason not noticed her come in? He closed his eyes again when he felt the pain spark behind them. Immediately someone was shaking him, and with a low groan he opened them again. Nausea, headache, fever, cold, vertigo, blackouts, delirium. He listed his symptoms without thinking twice about it. Maybe Bruce's training had paid off after all. Even to his own ears, he could hear how bad it sounded. Out of the corner of his eye, Jason caught movement. He turned to look, and every symptom he'd just listed and forgotten reappeared. He could feel another wave of nausea building. Bugs. What must have been hundreds of them crawling over the tiled walls towards him. Jason scrambled backwards as far as the enclosed stall allowed him, his head banging against the wall, and the pain that followed was a welcome distraction. Hallucinations, he added through gritted teeth, squeezing his eyes shut again. It didn't help. He could feel the damned things crawling over him. A hand slipped behind his head, successfully cushioning the blow when Jason flinched back a second time. He didn't dare open his eyes again. "Can you walk?" An arm wrapped around his waist before Jason, or anyone else for that matter, could respond, and he was hoisted up. He managed to stand for all of 2 seconds before the floor dropped out from beneath him. Jason almost missed the shout of worry. A heart monitor was beeping in the background. He could just make it out through the haziness in his head. He received no other warning before the pain returned. He opened his eyes and he immediately regretted it, when he was met with bright light shining down on him. He's awake! Jason really should have been more concerned that he couldn't place the voice. For now, he had more pressing worries. Like the glaring light shining so harshly that closing his eyes did nothing. Like the heart monitor that picked up the frequency now that Jason was awake. Like the splitting headache that only increased when Jason clenched his eyes shut. He shouldn't even be alive, someone else added. Jason gritted his teeth. He was inclined to agree. He almost wished he wasn't. Fire spread through his veins, burning him from the inside out. His muscles spasmed against his will. They tightened to a point of pain before all tension escaped him and left him exhausted. Before he could suppress a groan, Jason began coughing up his stomach contents. In his weak state, he couldn't even turn his head to the side. Choking in his own spit burned twice as badly as the bile had. He could just feel a hand at the edge of his consciousness, turning him to the side a lot more gently than Jason would have. He would have appreciated it if he didn't immediately go back to gagging, and if he couldn't feel his own sick running over his cheek. The taste of blood was heavy in his mouth. Not great. His muscles spasmed once more, and Jason was desperate enough to wish he'd black out again. For maybe the first time ever, the universe took pity on him. Jason struggled to open his eyes. When he first blinked them open, the world swam before him. He could just make out a blurred figure with dark hair, hidden by the shadows. Great. That narrowed it down to only half his family. When the shadows began moving, Jason closed his eyes once more, begging to be rid of whatever hallucinations still plagued him. when the pain returned tenfold, breaking through the fogginess in his mind, and Jason must have made some kind of sound, pulled some kind of grimace because his hand was taken in another. There were so many questions in his mind. Before one could escape, the hurt spiked again, and Jason was convinced he was dying. Again. A single demand was all that remained, and all that he had managed to voice. Burn my body. He hoped whoever got the message. He didn't want to come back. Not again. The hand squeezing his tightened, and Jason was sure he'd been understood. The pain had left him. Well, not entirely, but it was muted. Like an itch he couldn't scratch, a discomfort that was always present, hidden beneath an even deeper layer of exhaustion. Jason didn't try to fight the darkness that pulled at him. He knew when he'd lost a battle. He knew when to give up. Distantly, he could hear someone speaking, tone kept even and soft. Reading, his mind corrected. He was sure he recognized both the words and the voice, but in his broken state, he couldn't put a name to either. Jason drifted off once more, at least comforted that he wasn't alone. There was a sharp jab of pain in his forearm, and if Jason had the strength for it, he would have flinched away. He could see clearly at least his body. His body still felt as though there were cinder blocks in his chest, holding him down and pushing him into the bed. But he could see. He still felt like he was being burned alive, but only the warmth stayed, no pain. And he could finally see. Alfred leaned over him, and Jason felt another prick when he adjusted the IV. He glanced down at the tube connected to his vein. He hadn't noticed it before. Why hadn't he noticed it before? Scratch that. How had he not noticed it before? It explained the hurt and the deep-rooted exhaustion threatening to pull him back under. Normally he'd protest it. Not today. He turned his attention, the little he had left, back to Alfred. There was some relief to be found when Alfred didn't look any more worried than usual. Instead, his grandfather placed a hand over Jason's and gave him a reassuring smile. A smile that Jason desperately needed. Then Jason blinked and the shadows were moving again. Reaching out and curling towards, he could feel the familiar crawl of something along his arm, making its way to his neck, and he squeezed his eyes shut. "Oh, my poor boy," Alfred whispered. Jason could barely hear him over the sound of his own heart beating. However, he had no trouble feeling the hand that cradled his cheek, dragging a thumb over his skin, or the lips that pressed a kiss against his forehead. Jason could still feel the fire burning within him, making his breathing heavy and sticking him to the sheets with sweat. The cold was a shock to his system, a welcome shock, but a shock nonetheless. And without thinking twice, Jason flinched away from it. He blinked his eyes open, trying to gain some awareness of his surroundings. It still unnerved him to be this vulnerable and this unaware. His room in the manor, too dark, too warm. A hand touched his arm and stayed there. Not meant to comfort, just meant to let him know he wasn't alone. Jason would forever be grateful. He didn't know how else he could handle it. He hoped Barbara would understand as much from his expression. He doubted he'd be able to speak a coherent sentence. Judging from her soft smile, she got the sentiment. Her other hand hovered above his shoulder, still holding the damp cloth, and she watched Jason carefully. It took him longer than he'd like to admit to put two and two together. When he finally did, he gave her a decisive nod, and then let his eyes fall shut again. With his permission, she wiped over his brow again. If Jason had just a little more self-control, he would have stopped himself from leaning into her touch. If he had just a little more self-awareness, then he would have noticed her hand lingering. The coolness was a stark contrast to the heat pouring out from the rest of his body. It did little to clear the murkiness in his head, but he relished in the relief anyway. No pain, just a fever. He could work with that. Jason did his best to ignore the question that still burned in the back of his mind. He didn't think he had the strength to voice them. He didn't think he had the strength to hear the answer. Barbara wiped over his forehead again, and Jason was pulled out of his head. "Go back to sleep," she whispered. He was more than happy to comply. There was a quiet rustling to his left, not loud enough to worry him, but loud enough for Jason to be roused awake. He supposed he should be grateful that he wasn't that delirious anymore. Jason dropped his head to the side, light entreated from his bedroom door, burning his eyes to look at, and he grimaced at the pain rebuilding. To think his headache had been getting better. He pulled at his last defense, the only one that seemed available as of late, and squeezed his eyes shut. When he opened them again, black spots flashed before him. He squinted, and he could just make out a dark figure standing at the foot of his bed. How helpful. There was another rustling sound, and he watched them spread a blanket over the other person in his room. How had Jason not noticed them? Fuck. Whatever gratefulness he'd felt went out the window. He blinked again. He swore it didn't usually take his eyes this long to adjust. When they finally did, he could only stare in confusion. Bruce sat in the armchair by his side, arms crossed over the edge of Jason's bed, and head resting on them, asleep. Really, it was a testament to how out of it Jason still was, that he hadn't noticed the dip in the bed before. Alfred rearranged the blanket, tucking it tightly around Bruce's shoulders so it wouldn't slide off, and then he took a step back, and finally noticed Jason. "My apologies," Alfred said. His voice kept so low so he wouldn't disturb the atmosphere, or maybe so he wouldn't disturb Bruce. Either way, Jason was grateful for it. "I didn't mean to wake you." Were Jason not so tired that he was sure he'd fall asleep again within the next 5 minutes, regardless of whether he wanted to or not? Then he might have been mad. Instead, he gave Alfred a tired smile and let his eyes fall shut again. "Good night, Master Jason." A hand ran through his hair, brushing a strand away from where sweat plastered it against his forehead. Jason waited for the sound of footsteps retreating. When none came, he cracked an eye open to see Alfred doing the same to Bruce. He and Jason exchanged the last smile, then Jason let sleep claim him once more. There was a disturbance when he woke up again. Jason had to blink twice against the midday sun that streamed in through the window. Then he felt it again, a pair of hands working through his matted hair. He glanced up, just now making out the warm body next to him, and the hands in his hair stilled. Cass didn't look back at him. Still, Jason didn't have a doubt in his mind that she knew he was awake. He tried to run a hand through his hair as well, wanting to fix the pieces Cass had undoubtedly messed up. The ivy distracted him. He raised his arm a little further, frowning at the effort it took, and at the line that pulled uncomfortably at his forearm. Jason's first instinct was to pull it out. No. He glanced back up at Cass, and this time she was looking right at him. A small frown sat on her lips, matching Jason's own. She shook her head. He scowled. As usual, Cass was 3 steps ahead of him. Jason paused for a moment, trying to gather his strength so he could pull the ivy out. As if on cue, a shudder passed through his body. His muscles tightened and loosened rhythmically, making him bite his tongue against the urge to whimper. He thought he'd be done with it by now. He hoped it was over. Cass's hands loosened in his hair. Thank God for that. Jason didn't need her yanking it out on top of the burning sensation. The episode didn't last more than a minute. It was still too long. As if on cue, he became aware of everything else that still felt wrong. The bone-deep exhaustion making his limbs heavy to move, weighing him down, and trapping him under his blanket. The fever that still burned inside him, cooking him alive, not made any better by the thick sheets. Though his head still felt muddy, as though he couldn't string together coherent thought if he tried to. Cass removed her hands, and Jason tensed, hating himself for how quickly he missed the contact. Little piece of affection that proved he wasn't alone. It made him question why he wasn't. Briefly, he wondered if he'd prefer to suffer on his own, if being comforted really outweighed his need to protect himself. The question did nothing but make his head hurt. Jason turned to his side, mindful of the ivy this time. He shifted a little bit closer to Cass, close enough that she'd have to know it was intentional. If any of his siblings would understand, then it was her. Her hands went back to his hair, skillfully twisting the strands around her fingers, braiding. Jason's mind finally corrected for him. Were he a little more lucid, then he might have complained, just to keep up the image, if nothing else. Instead, he let it continue. "You alright?" Jason had barely been awake a second before Duke bombarded him with the question. If he were in better shape, then he might have snapped at him. Right after he asked why, of all the people he knew, Duke was sitting at his bedside. He doubted any of them were in a hurry to watch over him, but Duke? He definitely made the lower half of the list. Then again, Duke was also one of the few people he'd never pissed off too badly. Maybe he made the middle of the list. Instead of sharing his inner debate, he silently reviewed the cluster of symptoms in his head. He was still feverish, judging from the heat that curled in his stomach and the layer of sweat that he couldn't remember the last time he'd been rid of. His head still hurt. Every now and then he'd have a mini seizure. Could he call them that? Well, whatever they were, they hurt. He was also too tired to be awake for longer than an hour. Altogether, not great. Jason's eyes flickered to the side, a little past Duke, and focused on the string of ants climbing his wall. They twisted their way over a book Jason couldn't remember leaving on his windowsill, and worked their way towards his pillow. Again, not great. "I don't know. Do you see that?" Jason answered, and he winced at the gravelly tone. What did he expect? It was the first time he'd spoken since he had been bedridden. Meaning it had been... How long had it been? Duke followed Jason's gaze. Oh yeah, definitely, he responded in a completely serious tone. And Jason froze. Then Duke's expression shifted to a guilty one. Sorry, bad joke. Jason laughed nonetheless. It wasn't as though he had anything better to do. Then the action made his throat hurt, and he quickly shut up. When Duke handed him a glass of water completely unprompted, Jason was happy to accept it. Maybe he shouldn't be complaining about Duke being the one to sit by his side, but instead just be grateful that someone was. His hand shook so badly he was sure that he'd dropped the glass before it even reached his lips. Sheer spite and pride kept him from it. He would never live it down if he couldn't even drink without spilling on himself. He finished the water in record time, glad to finally not feel as though his throat was on fire. When Duke took the glass out of his hand, he didn't have the strength left to insist he could do it himself. The simple action left him exhausted. Without further comment, Jason dropped his eyes shut and leaned back, letting Duke get back to whatever the hell he'd been doing before. The next person to occupy the armchair was Damien, which made Jason fearful all by itself. He knew it was bad. Scratch that. He'd known it was bad when every time he woke up, a new family member was keeping guard. But Damien? What the hell had happened that even Damien was worried? What the hell had happened that made Damien feel the need to watch over him? If Duke had been near the bottom of his list, then Damien wasn't even on it. He was dying. He had to be. No other explanation. As if on cue, his headache spiked and his heart began beating faster. He could feel the heat crawling up his chest, threatening to choke his lungs and strangle him where he lied. He almost expected to seize again. Nothing happened of the sort. Instead, after about 5 minutes of inner panic, Damien finally looked up at him. The brothers stared at each other for another minute, and Jason was sure if he weren't this incapacitated, he would have been able to read Damien's expression. He would have been able to deduce every thought his brother had. Alas, the dots wouldn't quite connect, and he was left wondering. Staring like an idiot, more likely. Maybe Damien was trying to figure out what he'd tell the rest of his family when Jason passed away on his watch. Maybe he was trying to figure out which of Jason's possessions he'd claim when he was gone. He owned a leek dagger, one that Talia had gifted him all those years ago, and he had definitely seen Damien eyeing it up before. When Damien clicked his tongue and stood up, Jason wasn't the least bit surprised to watch him leave. His eyes trailed towards the discarded sketching pad Damien had left in the chair. His surprise only increased when there were multiple sketches of his sleeping form. Practice, most likely. Or Jason was definitely dying, and Bruce wanted a last portrait of his son. Oh no. His inner crisis was short-lived. Damien returned after what couldn't have been more than a minute. He returned holding Alfred the cat in his arms, and then he passed by the edge of the bed. He set Alfred down on his chest, just where the symbol would be if he was donning the suit. And then he took his seat in the chair again, picking his sketchbook up as he did. Alfred turned once, then twice, and finally curled up, tucking his nose beneath his tail. Jason only watched in amazement. After a minute of doing nothing, Damien clicked his tongue again, and Jason granted him his attention. He likes to be scratched behind his ears, Damien said, with more authority in his tone than any 13-year-old had the right to have. He kept staring until Jason slowly, and painfully, pulled a hand out from under the covers, and did as Damien had told him to. Alfred was fluffy to touch, and when Jason began petting, his eyes flitted half-closed, and he began purring. Loudly. A soft rumbling that Jason could feel in his chest. Maybe he wasn't dying after all. Loud laughter made Jason flinch awake, turning to his side to glare at the offender. He found none. Instead, he focused on the computer screen just a mere foot away from his side. The sitcom played on in front of him, one character dropping a particularly scathing line, and then the typical audience laughter was back. It did nothing for the near-constant headache Jason seemed to have nowadays, not to mention the screen burned to look at. A hand made its way into his line of sight, first pressing the decrease volume key. Then it hesitated above the space bar, before finally pausing the show. Jason followed the hand to the arm to the face, and Steph raised an eyebrow at him. It was meant to be a question, he was sure of it, but even pretend annoyance that Jason, having disrupted her show, couldn't hide the underlying concern. God, he couldn't wait for them to stop pitying him. If he had enough strength for it, and maybe, if finally he could stop burning up, then Jason would have walked out. Instead, he did his best to stop analyzing Steph's every move and thereby make his headache even worse. What happened? he finally asked. His voice sounded rough, even to his own ears. Either dehydration or disuse, or both. Steph's expression softened unbelievably, and Jason turned away. He lied on his back again, staring at the ceiling instead of his sister. He hated how just that simple action increased his fatigue. "You don't remember?" Steph asked him. This time she made no attempt to hide the concern in her tone. Jason didn't know whether he preferred or despised that. Instead of admitting that he really had no clue, that the last however long has been summarized by a flash of different moments of being awake, that he couldn't remember what was wrong, but just that something was, he shrugged. "You should be dead." Jason's lip quirked up into a smile. "Again," Steph added before he could, and he smiled even more brightly. He trusted himself, and that Steph might have wiped that pitying expression off of her face. And he glanced up at her. She was smiling as well. "You drank from Bruce's glass at the gala, which was poison, of course." "Of course." She laughed. "And it should have killed you. It would have killed any normal person who didn't have some Lazarus pit in them. So in any way, I guess we're lucky that you drank it and not Bruce." She looked at Jason, who glared at her, and an expression of guilt replaced her hopeful one. He agreed with her, but that didn't make the experience any more pleasant for him. "Why do I still feel bad?" Jason asked, and he swore that if he weren't still this sick and pitiful, then he never would have admitted it. "Your body's trying to fight it off." Jason huffed. "It's doing a pretty shit job." She laughed again, not a hint of pity in her tone, and Jason turned back on his side to face her. As if in silent agreement, Steph turned back to her screen, and Jason shifted closer. She turned the screen so he could watch better, a nice gesture, but Jason wasn't planning on it. Already, his eyes were beginning to fall shut, and he couldn't wait to finally be done with this fever. He couldn't breathe. His chest burned with the effort. In, his lungs stuttered, and out. Not again. Already, he felt the tiny critters crawling over him, starting by his hand and slowly working their way up his arms. Making a home beneath the sleeve of his shirt without thinking twice, Jason began scratching anything to get the damn things off him. Hands grabbed his wrist and held them tightly to his chest. It wasn't enough for Jason to stop fighting. If anything, it was just another sign that something was wrong. Short of breath, fever, nausea, delirium. Not again. He hadn't even recovered from... Jason. He froze. "Barbie, open your eyes." Barbara continued, and she might have picked up on the change in his demeanor because her hand softened the tight grip with which she'd held him. He did what she asked, surprising himself with the interior of his room. A soft light emitting from the lamp in the corner. He was at the manor, still in bed, still recovering. Barbara sat by his side, watching Jason with concern, and he wanted more than anything for her pity to go away. Then again, he was still shaking. His heartbeat was at a minimum 10 times faster than it should be, and Jason didn't have a doubt in his mind that he looked even worse than he felt. Maybe a little pity was warranted. Barbara let go of his wrist, slowly, hesitantly, almost as though she were afraid that Jason would go back to tearing his forearms. He glanced down, angry red marks glittering his skin, and he was sure they wouldn't be gone anytime soon. Maybe a lot of pity was warranted. Thank God Alfred took the IV out, Barbara muttered, and Jason laughed. The little joke did more to comfort him than anything else she could have offered. It also did well to distract him from the fact that he had no recollection whatsoever of someone removing the IV. When her arm wrapped around him and pulled him towards her, Jason didn't protest. He doubted he had the strength to fight her anyway. He ducked his head a little, had to, considering how much taller he was, and she wasted no time in raising her head so that he could tuck his underneath. He was fine. He would be. He'd survive. He always did. "How are you feeling?" Dick asked after giving Jason a polite 5 minutes to wake up. A certain someone should take notes. His fever had never broken. It was the first thing that came to Jason's mind. He was still exhausted. He still felt like merely sitting up would be a chore. He still had a headache that made him want to claw his eyes out, but he wasn't consumed by hellfire anymore. That was nice. It also meant that he wasn't in danger anymore, that he was well into recovery, and that it didn't make sense for his siblings to still be sitting at his bedside. He shoved that thought to the back of his mind. He'd figure it out later when he was alone. Instead, he focused on the significantly less nice fact that he could still smell the sweat on his clothes. His blanket was damp from it now. As if the universe thought it was funny, he was fucking freezing. He saved Dick the monologue and simply answered, "Cold." His brother had the audacity to laugh. Then he stripped off his hoodie, a light blue one that Jason could distantly recall stealing back in his Robin days, and he held it out towards Jason as an apology. Or maybe just as a nice gesture, but considering how miserable he felt, Jason thought he deserved an apology. With an unimpressed glare, Jason took the hoodie from Dick, lying it across his bed. Then he made quick work of peeling off his t-shirt, frowning when it stuck to his skin uncomfortably. The simple action still took too much out of him. Next came the hoodie. Jason had barely gotten his arms into the sleeves when Dick left his seat, taking a step forward to, presumably, assist him. "I can do it myself," he snapped, frowning at the harsh tone he'd used. Maybe a little overdramatic. Then again, he'd been bedridden for... how long exactly? He deserved to be a little dramatic. Dick just sat back down again, kicking his legs out onto the edge of Jason's bed and crossing his arms across his chest as he watched with mild amusement. When Jason did actually struggle to get the hoodie over his head, Dick made his amusement audible as well. Really living up to his namesake, wasn't he? He managed to pull the hoodie on after a minute of fighting. If it weren't as comfortable and warm as it was, then Jason might have voiced his insults as well. Instead, he continued spitting them in his head as he waited for Dick to stop laughing. He finally did and promptly stood up as well. "Where are you going?" Jason asked as he mentally berated himself when he realized how clingy it sounded. Dick smiled. "To get a hoodie." Jason just raised an eyebrow and Dick was quick to raise his hand in surrender. "What? I underestimated how cold it was." This time it was Jason's turn to laugh. Jason watched Tim gather up cards after what he was sure was at least the 12th round of solitaire. His brother shuffled them a few minutes, managing a cool trick that Jason would never admit he was impressed by. Then he began laying the cards down anew. He'd been watching for the last half hour. It was starting to get boring. "You really have no hobbies, do you?" Jason broke their silence and Tim jumped. He waited patiently for a response, hoping it might reveal an answer to his personal mystery as well. Why the hell was Tim here? Jason was feeling... not great, but okay-ish. As okay as he usually felt, plus minus a little more exhaustion. He highly doubted that Tim didn't have anything better to do than spend the night playing solitaire in Jason's room. Correction. He highly hoped that Tim had something better to do. Tim's hand froze where it had been hovering over the last card and stared up at Jason with wide eyes. "You're awake!" Jason resisted the urge to smile. "You really are the smart one." When Tim's expression darkened, he stopped trying to prevent himself from laughing. Tim's frown deepening really just made it even funnier. In a quick motion, Tim swiped the card up again and began shuffling once more. A few more elaborate tricks during which he kept eye contact with Jason, and Jason was sure now that Tim was just trying to show off. And succeeding at it. Not that Jason would tell him. Tim passed the cards out in a practiced motion, switching back and forth between Jason and himself, until both had 3 cards. The rest of the stack he set on Jason's bed, and between the both, with one card lying open next to it. Jason only took one look at his cards before he chuckled again. Maybe the universe was trying to make amends to him. "What?" Tim frowned at him, already on the defensive. His eyes ping-ponging between his own cards and Jason. Jason didn't waste any time before he set his cards down on the table, letting Tim count the 31 he'd been dealt. "I win." Tim scowled at him, and he tossed his own cards on the bed next to Jason. 16. Not even close to enough. "You cheated," Tim said before Jason could gloat. Not that he was going to. Jason just laughed at him. "You dealt me the cards." He rebutted, and Tim didn't seem the least bit fazed by his answer. Instead of complaining anymore, he shrugged and gathered the cards in his hands again. "Just so you know, I dealt you a winning hand because I pity you," Tim said under his breath, and Jason only laughed louder. Tim smiled, just for a moment, then he hid his face as he began shuffling the cards once more. He just laid the first card down when Jason interrupted him. "Go back to playing solitaire," Jason told him, already laying back down in his bed. After a second of hesitation, he scooted over so that Tim had more room to lay out his cards. His brother looked at him for a second, concern clear in his eyes, and Jason did his best to hide how tired he still was. How long would it be until these simple interactions didn't take his entire strength away? "Maybe you'll finally get good at it," he added when the worry didn't light up. It worked like a charm. Tim's jaw dropped in disbelief. Jason drifted off to Tim's whining about how he was in the top percentile of playing, and how his average time was even better than Bruce's. He didn't catch the rest. Jason could just make out the quiet voice reading to him. He didn't know whether he should be proud or ashamed that he recognized the book first. He turned to his side, doing his best to blink the sleep away, and his eyes settled on Bruce. His father sat on the armchair, legs crossed in front of him and book held just beneath the small lamp. All it took were 3 seconds of Jason watching him before Bruce paused and looked up. He met Jason's eyes, giving him a warm smile, and then looked back down and continued reading. The smile didn't leave his lips. Jason continued watching him. He tried to muster up the courage to ask what he'd been wondering this entire break. If he didn't ask now, he didn't think he ever would. As usual, Bruce knew what he wanted just a second before Jason had made up his mind. At this rate, he was almost as bad as Cass, if not worse. Bruce lowered the book, carefully setting a finger in between the pages, and he directed his full attention towards Jason. All he had to do now was ask, "Why are you here?" The question sounded harsh, even to his own ears. It sounded even more harsh when Bruce frowned at him, brow furrowing like it did whenever Jason said something disappointing. He removed his finger from the book and replaced it with an actual bookmark. Then he set it on the nightstand. Jason pushed himself up in the bed, just enough that he could lean on one elbow and face his father at eye level. Bruce opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Jason interrupted him. He had to correct himself. "Not that I don't appreciate it." He did. He truly did. More than he'd ever be able to express most likely. He still needed Bruce to understand that, even if he couldn't admit it. But I don't understand why. I mean, I haven't been alone once, and... He trailed off. He still didn't know. Bruce's expression softened unbelievably. Jason couldn't remember the last time Bruce had looked at him that way. It made a whole new array of emotion burst in his chest, and he quickly swallowed back the other embarrassing words that now burned in his throat. "A week," Bruce finished for him. 9 days to be exact. His father still held such concern in his eyes for him. Jason couldn't bear it. He took the next opportunity that presented itself to look at his hands instead. Bruce hadn't answered his question. Jason could practically hear him hesitating, thinking it over, trying to puzzle together the perfect answer. "Would you like me to leave?" As per usual, he failed. Jason's head whipped back up at that, staring at his father with disbelief. What? No. In any other situation, he might have been embarrassed at his quick response. Just another thing he could blame on his exhaustion tomorrow. "I just need to know why." Bruce smiled at him again. Jason was sure he saw some kind of relief in Bruce's expression, or maybe he was just hoping for it. When Bruce reached to take his hand, Jason followed the movement with his eyes. He didn't make any attempt to stop him, and Bruce clasped Jason's hand firmly between his own. "I'm here because you asked me to be," his father answered. Simple as that. No further explanation. And now it was Jason's turn to be confused. Another few seconds passed, in which Bruce's expression changed from one of reassurance to unease. When Jason continued to show no sign of recognition, Bruce's hand tightened. "You don't remember?" he asked, knitting his brow together once more. He asked as though both of them didn't know the answer to the question. Wordlessly, Jason shook his head. He'd known that he hadn't been in the right state of mind the past week. It had been clear by the blatant gaps in his memory, but this? This was something else entirely. How could Jason not remember that? Bruce cleared his throat, moving to drag Jason out of his thoughts, maybe to steady his own voice as he explained. "Right after the gala in the cave, you kept losing consciousness. We thought—" Bruce cut himself off and cleared his throat again. Jason could imagine well enough what his family had thought, and, inadvertently, he squeezed Bruce's hand. You asked me to not leave you alone." An important distinction, one Jason was very grateful for. He remembered it like it was yesterday, not in its entirety apparently, but enough to remember the pain he'd felt lying on the cot, and to remember listening to the heart monitor speed up. He didn't have a single doubt in his mind that he had begged for something. The words dried up in his throat. What could he say? That he appreciated it? That he hadn't thought they'd actually do it? That he hadn't thought they cared enough? All he could manage to get up was a choked up, "Thank you." Bruce didn't hesitate to answer. Of course. A blind promise instead of a simple, "You're welcome." The difference wasn't lost on Jason. Ever so gently, Bruce let go of Jason's hand, and he was given a moment to recollect himself. His father knew him too well. Or maybe Bruce needed the moment as much as Jason did. It didn't matter. Jason lied back down, more relieved than he'd admit to not have to hold himself up anymore, and to finally have his question answered. He closed his eyes, and it didn't take long for him to hear the telltale rustle of Bruce picking the book back up. He'd barely read 3 words when Jason cracked an eye open again, and his father paused mid-sentence. "Can you go back a chapter?" Jason asked. He dropped his head to the side, giving Bruce the sweetest smile he could muster. Bruce just raised an eyebrow at him. "I was asleep, and Darcy's letter is one of the best parts." He protested, not whined, no matter what Bruce's amused expression seemed to imply. "Of course," Bruce replied, another promise. Bruce began reading the right chapter, and Jason closed his eyes for real this time. And he knew that when he opened them again, he wouldn't be alone. Alright guys, and that is the end of Bedrotten by Alexa Effect. I hope you guys liked it, and I'll see you next video.